What if the biggest mistake 50 Cent ever made wasn't something he did, but something he didn't do? No warning, no drama, just one silent move that may have set everything in motion the moment he landed in Houston. Because in a city tied to power like J. Prince, missing one step isn't small, it's everything. And what allegedly happened next might completely change how you see power in hip-hop. What if I told you that sometimes the biggest mistake isn't loud, it's silent? No warning, no announcement, just one move you didn't make. And by the time you realize it mattered, everything's already in motion. Because that's exactly what this situation feels like. Picture this for a second. A global icon, someone whose entire reputation is built on surviving the impossible, 50 Cent. A man who's faced real danger, real pressure, and walked away stronger every time. The kind of name people associate with being untouchable. Now imagine him stepping off a plane in Houston. On the surface, everything looks perfect. Luxury waiting, security in place, confidence at its peak. The kind of arrival that usually comes with control. But beneath all of that, something was missing. Something small, almost invisible to outsiders, but in Houston, it's everything. The check-in. And that's where this story takes a turn. Because Houston doesn't move like New York. It doesn't move like LA. It has its own rhythm, its own structure, its own rules that aren't written anywhere. But everybody who understands the city knows they exist. And at the center of that structure is J. Prince. Now, if you only know the surface, you might see him as just another music executive. But that's not the full picture. His influence runs deeper than music. It stretches into relationships, into networks, into a system that's been built over decades. A system rooted in respect, awareness, and alignment. So when someone enters that environment, especially someone with a name as big as 50 Cent, there's an expectation. Not about permission, not about weakness, but about acknowledgement. And according to what's been circulating for years, that step didn't happen. No call, no message, no signal that he tapped into the system already in place. And in most cities, that might not mean anything. But in Houston, that's where things shift. Because here, it's not just about who you are globally, it's about how you move locally. And when that alignment isn't there, you don't blend in, you stand out. Not loudly, quietly. Strategically. That's why insiders say the moment word spread that he was in the city without checking in, something changed. Not publicly, not in headlines, but underneath the surface, where information moves faster than anything you can see. And then the unthinkable. Jewelry gone, chain gone, and one of the loudest voices in hip-hop suddenly went quiet. No explosive reaction, no immediate response, just silence. And if you understand who 50 Cent is, that silence says more than any diss track ever could. Because this isn't just about one moment. It's about a system that most people never see. While fans focus on charts, streams, and headlines, there's another layer to the industry, one built on relationships, territory, and respect. Houston is one of those places where that layer matters the most. It's not just a city, it's an ecosystem. And inside that ecosystem, checking in isn't about asking for approval, it's about activating awareness. It's about making sure the right people know you're there, so you're not moving as an unknown variable. Because once you're outside that system, things can unfold in ways you don't expect. That's why this story isn't really about whether something happened or didn't happen. It's about understanding how power actually works behind the scenes. Because when you look at someone like J. Prince, you're not just looking at one individual. You're looking at decades of connections, influence, and calculated positioning. The kind of presence where even rumors carry weight, not because of what's confirmed, but because of what people believe is possible. And that belief alone can shape outcomes. So when the narrative started building that 50 Cent entered Houston without aligning with that structure, It didn't just sound like gossip to people who understand the culture. It sounded like a break in protocol. And in certain environments, protocol isn't optional. It's survival. Which brings us back to the real question. Was this just a random situation that got blown out of proportion? Or was it something deeper? A quiet reminder of how things actually move when the cameras aren't rolling. Because in Houston, messages don't always come with warnings. Sometimes they find you first. Because at this point, the story stops being about who 50 Cent is and starts becoming about where he is. And that shift changes everything. Because Houston isn't just another stop on a tour schedule. It isn't just another city where fame automatically translates into control. Houston operates on a completely different frequency. The power structure is different. The expectations are different. And the consequences, they don't always come with warnings. So by the time people started connecting the dots, by the time quiet whispers turned into real conversations, one question was already sitting in the air, heavy, unavoidable. Did 50 Cent underestimate Houston, or did Houston remind him? And what happened next only made that question even louder. Up until this point, everything feels subtle, controlled, almost invisible. No chaos, no headlines, no explosive moment you can point to and say, that's when it started. Instead, it feels like pressure building beneath the surface. Quiet, calculated, like something is being set in motion where most people can't see it. Because according to the narrative that's circulated in the culture for years, situations like this don't erupt instantly. They evolve. Slowly, strategically. And that's what makes it dangerous. Because the moment it became known, at least within certain circles, that 50 Cent had entered Houston without checking in, that information didn't just sit still. It moved. Through conversations, through relationships, through a network most outsiders don't even realize exists. A network built on decades of trust, loyalty, and awareness. In that kind of environment, nothing stays private for long. Not arrivals, not hotel check-ins, not movements, especially not when the right people are paying attention. So before 50 could even settle in, before he could fully move how he normally moves, there were already whispers circulating. He's here, and he didn't check in. Now to the average person, that might not sound like anything serious, but in a city like Houston, that kind of information carries weight, because it doesn't just signal presence, it signals misalignment, a break in protocol. And once that perception takes hold, it starts shaping how people respond to you, even if you don't realize it. And here's the twist most people don't expect. At first, nothing happens. No immediate reaction, no loud confrontation, no chaos. And that's exactly what makes it feel even more calculated. Because if this was random, if this was just bad luck, it would have been instant, messy, unpredictable. But that's not how situations like this are said to unfold. Instead, it becomes a process. Watching, waiting, studying patterns, observing movements. Almost like a test. And through all of that, 50 Cent is moving like everything is normal. Luxury hotel, security detail, high-profile presence. The confidence of someone who has spent years being one of the most dominant and fearless figures in hip-hop. A man whose entire identity is built on being untouchable. But this is where the real conflict begins. Because while 50's reputation follows him everywhere globally, Houston doesn't operate on global reputation alone. In this city, your name doesn't automatically activate protection. Your relationships do. And without those relationships, without that check-in, you're not plugged into anything. You're visible, but you're not covered. And that's a dangerous position to be in. Now imagine this scenario. You're a high-profile figure. People know who you are. They know where you're staying. They know your movements. But at the same time, they also know you're not aligned with the local structure. You're not connected to the network that controls awareness in that environment. That's when things shift, because now it's no longer just tension. It becomes opportunity. And according to what's been said over time, that opportunity didn't go unnoticed. At some point during his stay, something happened that changed everything. The jewelry gone, the chain gone, and just like that, the idea that 50 Cent was untouchable in every environment started to crack. But here's where the situation becomes even more intense. Because people who understand how Houston moves didn't frame this as random. They didn't see it as coincidence. They didn't treat it like someone just got lucky. The way it was described, the timing, the setting, the circumstances, it pointed to something more deliberate. And that's when the narrative shifts completely. This isn't just 50 Cent got robbed. It becomes 50 Cent got caught lacking in a city where he didn't follow protocol. And in Houston, that difference means everything. Now think about why this moment hits so hard. This is a man who survived being shot 9 times, a man who built an empire off conflict, someone who has never been afraid to respond, to retaliate, to turn every situation into a moment of dominance. When 50 Cent faces pressure, he usually turns it into content, into strategy, into something loud and undeniable. But this time, nothing. No explosive posts, no immediate reaction, no public targeting of anyone involved. Just silence. And that silence became louder than anything he could have said. Because people started asking questions. Why didn't he respond? Why didn't he call anyone out? Why didn't he turn this into another chapter of his dominance? And that's where the second layer of the story comes in. Because to people who understand the deeper dynamics, that silence didn't look like weakness. It looked like awareness. It looked like calculation. It looked like someone recognizing the environment they were in and choosing not to escalate. Because who do you respond to when there's no single opponent? Who do you diss when the situation isn't about one person, but a system? That's the part most outsiders miss. This wasn't a traditional conflict. There was no clear enemy, no direct name to call out, no obvious target to attack publicly. And when you're dealing with something like that, something rooted in networks, in relationships, in unseen influence, the rules change completely. Even for someone like 50 Cent. And as the story continued to circulate, people started connecting more dots. The hotel, the timing, the way information allegedly spread the moment he landed, the idea that everything developed after it became known he didn't check in. Piece by piece, it started forming a picture. Not a confirmed one, not something officially acknowledged, but a narrative that made sense within the context of how Houston operates. And once that narrative took hold, it did something even bigger than the incident itself. It sent a message, not just to 50 Cent, but to everyone watching. Because if someone at his level, his reputation, his resources, his influence, could allegedly find himself in that position, then what does that say about everyone else? It reinforces something deeper. In certain places, fame isn't the ultimate protection. Respect is. Alignment is. Understanding the system you're stepping into, that's what really matters. And ignoring that, it comes with consequences. Now this is where things become even more layered. Because as the conversation grew, as more people started paying attention, voices from within the culture began speaking on it. Not directly confirming details, but reinforcing the idea that Houston operates differently, that there are rules, and that those rules have been enforced before. Which brings everything back to one name, J. Prince. Because whether he was directly involved or not isn't even the main point. His name sits at the center of the conversation because of what he represents. A system, an ecosystem, a network built over decades. That's real power, not just influence you see, but influence you feel without it ever needing to be announced. And when your presence carries that kind of weight, situations don't have to be claimed to be connected to you. People connect them automatically. That's the level this operates on. So now the situation isn't just about what happened to 50 Cent. It becomes about what it represents. A collision between two different types of power. On one side, a global superstar whose name dominates headlines, charts, and culture worldwide. On the other, a localized system built on relationships, respect, and control within a specific environment. And when those two forces meet, the outcome isn't always what people expect. Because in that moment, in that city, the rules weren't written by fame. They were written by something deeper. And for the first time in a long time, 50 Cent was operating outside of his usual advantage. That's the real conflict. That's the shift. And just when it seemed like the situation couldn't get any more intense, that's when it escalated even further. Because what started as quiet whispers didn't stay quiet. It spread. It grew. And the more it spread, the more people started bringing up other situations, other names, other moments that had been floating in the background for years, now being looked at differently. And one of the biggest names that kept coming up in those conversations was Jay-Z. Now nothing tied to that was ever fully confirmed. It was always vague, always just out of reach. But the way it was referenced carried the same underlying message. That even someone at Jay-Z's level, one of the most powerful figures in the entire music industry, allegedly experienced complications in Houston after not following protocol. And when you place that next to what people were saying about 50 Cent, it stops feeling like coincidence. It starts feeling like a pattern, a system. And that realization is what really made people step back. Because now this isn't just about one artist. It's about a rule that doesn't bend. A structure that doesn't adjust based on fame, money, or reputation. In Houston, the rules stay the same. And that idea alone is what made this story feel bigger than anyone expected. Because now the question isn't just what happened. It's how many people didn't realize the same thing until it was too late. And that's when the situation stopped being a story and turned into a debate. Because now, people weren't just asking what happened to 50 Cent. They were questioning the entire system behind it. Two completely different perspectives started colliding. On one side, you had those who defended the idea of checking in. To them, it wasn't about control or pressure. It was about respect, about structure, about understanding that when you step into a city like Houston, you're entering an environment that already has its own ecosystem in place. In view, checking in isn't submission, it's strategy. It's how you move smart, how you stay protected, how you make sure you're connected to the right people before anything can go wrong. But then there was the other side. The side that saw it completely differently. They weren't calling it respect, they were calling it pressure, control, a system that forces compliance under the label of culture. And once that perspective started gaining traction, everything escalated. Because now this wasn't just about one artist or one incident. It became a bigger question. Is this system justified, or is it something else entirely? And right at the center of that storm was Jay Prince. Not because he was out there giving interviews or explaining anything directly, but because his name is tied to the foundation of what people were debating. His influence, his history, his role in building the structure people believe Houston operates on. And that's what made it so powerful. Because even in silence, his presence shaped the entire conversation. Now here's where things take another turn. As the debate kept growing, one detail started standing out more than anything else. 50 Cent's reaction, or more specifically, the lack of it. At this point, the story had spread too far to ignore. Fans were talking, media outlets were hinting, the culture was buzzing, and yet, still nothing. No explosive response. No direct denial. No public confrontation. And if there's one thing everyone knows about 50 Cent, it's that he doesn't stay quiet. He addresses. He reacts. He turns moments into narratives that work in his favor. But this time, silence. And that silence didn't go unnoticed. Because people started shifting the question. It wasn't just, why didn't he respond, anymore. It became, what did he understand that we do? And that question changed everything. Because now the silence wasn't being seen as avoidance. It was being seen as awareness, as calculation, as someone recognizing that this wasn't a normal situation, something you handle with a post, a diss track, or a viral moment. This was something different, something deeper. And once that idea took hold, the story elevated again. Because now it wasn't just about an alleged incident. It was about what that incident revealed. That there are layers to this industry most people never see. Systems that exist parallel to fame. Structures that don't rely on visibility to maintain power. Environments where influence isn't measured in followers or headlines, but in relationships, in networks, in control. And that realization hit hard. Because it challenges one of the biggest assumptions in hip-hop, that being the biggest name in the room means you're the one in control. In Houston, according to this narrative, that's not always true. And just when people thought they understood the situation, it got even more intense. Because now the focus shifted forward. Not just what happened, but what happens next. Because this didn't just fade away, it evolved. There were subtle signals, indirect comments, hints of tension between 50 Cent and Jay Prince. Nothing loud, nothing explosive, but enough to suggest that something underneath the surface hadn't fully settled. And that's where the stakes get higher. Because now this isn't just about a past moment. It's about an ongoing dynamic. Two powerful figures, two completely different approaches to power, moving in overlapping spaces. On one side, you have 50 Cent expanding his reach, business ventures, media influence, strategic moves even in places like Texas, a global presence that continues to grow. On the other side, you have a long-established system, a structure built over decades, one that has already defined how that environment operates long before new players step in. And when those two paths cross, something has to give. That's the tension. That's the escalation. But here's the part that ties everything together. This story was never just about Houston. It was about a bigger question that affects the entire culture. What matters more, your name or your network? Because if even part of this narrative is true, then it suggests something that challenges everything people think they know about power in hip-hop. That no matter how big you are, no matter how untouchable you seem, there are still places, still systems where you have to adapt or face consequences. And that idea alone is what made this impossible to ignore. Because it doesn't just tell a story, it forces you to rethink how the game really works. And just when it feels like you've understood it, that's when the final layer starts to unfold. Because by the time this narrative fully spread, the reaction wasn't just loud. It was divided, completely split between two worlds. On the outside looking in, fans, casual listeners, the reaction was shock, confusion, even disbelief. How does something like this happen to 50 Cent? This is someone whose entire brand is dominance, survival, fearlessness at the highest level. The idea that he could be caught off guard in any situation didn't make sense to a lot of people. So naturally, many dismissed it. They called it exaggerated, internet talk, Another rumor blown out of proportion because a big name was attached to it. To them, the idea that someone with his level of experience, security, and resources could be vulnerable like that just didn't add up. But then there was the other side. The people who didn't question it at all. The ones who heard the story and simply said, "That's Houston." And that reaction alone says everything. Because within certain circles, people who understand how cities like Houston operate, the story didn't feel shocking. It felt predictable. Not because of who 50 Cent is, but because of where he was and how he allegedly moved. And that's when the conversation shifted again. From "did this happen" to something deeper. Why does this happen? And as more voices from within the culture started speaking, not always directly about the incident, but about the system behind it, everything pointed back to the same structure associated with J. Prince. Some reinforced the idea that checking in isn't new, that it's been part of certain regions for decades, a way to maintain order, a way to prevent chaos when high-profile figures move through environments with established dynamics. From that perspective, what allegedly happened wasn't a failure of 50 Cent. It was the system working exactly the way it was designed to. But not everyone agreed. Because as the discussion expanded, criticism got louder. Some artists, commentators, and insiders started questioning whether this was really about respect or something else. They argued that requiring someone to check in just to move safely starts to blur the line between protocol and pressure. And once that argument entered the conversation, everything got heated. Because now this wasn't just about one situation. It became philosophical. One side defending the system, saying it protects, saying it stabilizes, saying it's about moving smart. The other side challenging it, saying it limits independence, saying it forces compliance, saying it shouldn't exist in a global industry. And right in the middle of that clash, 50 Cent's situation. Not as a confirmed fact, but as a symbol. A case study people used to support whichever side they believed in. And while the public debate got louder, something else happened that was just as telling. The industry itself stayed quiet. No major figures jumping in with strong opinions. No clear sides being taken. Just careful, measured responses or silence. And that silence spoke volumes. Because it suggested something deeper. That this isn't a simple topic. That it involves layers, relationships, business ties, regional connections that most people don't fully understand. Because when you operate at that level, speaking too openly about something like this doesn't just create headlines. It creates consequences. So instead of loud reactions, what you saw were subtle signals, indirect comments, people acknowledging that different cities move differently without fully endorsing or rejecting the system. And sometimes, that kind of response tells you more than anything direct ever could. Because it shows that even at the highest levels, there's an understanding. Certain dynamics exist, whether people agree with them or not. And that brings everything back to one final focus. 50 Cent himself. Because in the middle of all this noise, all this debate, all these perspectives, his position became one of the most talked about parts of the entire situation. Not just what happened to him, but how he chose to move after it. And by this point, the story had taken on a life of its own. Because now, it wasn't just about what allegedly happened to 50 Cent. It was about how people chose to interpret it. Some fans felt like his name was being used, that the narrative was bigger than him, that it was pushing an image of Houston, shaping a reputation, turning one situation into a symbol of something much larger. To them, this wasn't about facts, it was about framing. But others saw something completely different. They believed his alleged experience was exposing a reality that doesn't get talked about openly enough. Something that's always been there, but rarely discussed at this level, with a name this big attached to it. And right in the middle of those two perspectives was silence. Because by now, 50 Cent's silence had become one of the most powerful parts of the entire story. No response, no breakdown, no attempt to control the narrative. Just nothing. And in that silence, people started filling in the gaps themselves. Some said he was being strategic, refusing to give attention to something that didn't deserve it. Others believed he understood exactly what environment he was in and made a calculated decision not to escalate. And then there were those who went even further, suggesting that the silence itself confirmed there was more going on than what the public could see. And that's the thing about silence in moments like this. It doesn't shut the conversation down. It fuels it. Because when someone known for being loud, for responding, for turning every situation into a moment, suddenly goes quiet, people assume there's a reason. A deliberate reason. And that assumption keeps the narrative alive. Now zoom out for a second. Because what you're really watching here isn't just reactions to one situation. It's a reflection of how the culture understands power, how it defines respect, how it navigates the tension between independence and structure. Because that's what this moment represents at its core, a collision. On one side, you have a global figure who built his identity on not answering to anyone, on control, on dominance, on moving without limits. On the other side, you have a localized system that expects acknowledgement from everyone who steps into its space, no matter how big their name is. And depending on who you ask, one of those forces has to adapt. Either the system evolves, or the individual does. And that's exactly why this conversation hasn't faded. Because there's no clear answer, no resolution, just perspectives, and a growing realization that the rules of the game might not be as simple as people once believed. Which leads to the biggest question still hanging in the air. If someone like 50 Cent can allegedly find himself in this kind of situation, what does that mean for everyone else? That question is what keeps this story alive. And just when it feels like every angle has been explored, every argument made, every theory debated, that's when the final twist begins to form. Because up until now, the entire narrative has been built on one idea. That 50 Cent made a mistake, entered Houston without aligning with the system, and faced consequences for it. That's the version that spread. That's the version people argued over. That's the version that became a cultural talking point. But what if that's not the full story? What if the real story isn't just about what happened, but about what happened after? Because as time passed, something subtle started to shift. Not in headlines, not in viral moments, but in movement, in positioning, in strategy. Because instead of backing away, 50 Cent leaned in. Business moves, media expansion, a stronger presence in places connected to Texas, especially Houston. And suddenly, the narrative that once painted him as someone who got checked started to feel incomplete. Because people began noticing something that didn't line up. If the situation was truly one-sided, if the message was meant to push him out, then why is he still moving there? That question changes everything. Because now the story isn't about retreat. It's about response. Is he adapting? Or is he quietly challenging the system in his own way? And that's where things get complicated. Because on the other side of this equation is Jay Prince, a figure whose influence doesn't rely on noise. Someone who doesn't need to respond publicly because the structure around him already speaks for itself. So now you have two completely different forms of power operating in the same space. One built on visibility, media, global influence. The other built on relationships, history, a system that doesn't need approval to exist. And neither one is stepping back. That's the real twist. Because what looked like a one-time situation might actually be something bigger. Not a traditional feud, not a back and forth, but a quiet clash between two different philosophies of power. And the craziest part, it's happening without clear lines being drawn. No official statements, no direct confrontations, just movements, signals, decisions that only people paying close attention can see. Because while the audience is still debating the past, the people involved are already focused on the future. And that future, it's uncertain. Because there's one reality nobody can ignore. You can't build long-term influence in a place where your presence is constantly being questioned. At some point, something has to shift. Either the system adjusts, or the individual forces change. And right now, it's not clear which direction this is going. But here's where the tension peaks. The more 50 Cent expands, the more visible he becomes in spaces connected to Texas, the more pressure builds. Not publicly, but underneath. Just like everything else in this story. Quiet, calculated, strategic. And that leads to one final question nobody has been able to answer yet. Is this story already over? Or is it just getting started? Because if history has shown anything, it's that situations like this don't disappear. They evolve. They resurface. They grow into something bigger when the timing is right. And right now, that timing feels like it's building. Slowly, silently, and when it finally reaches that point, the next move won't just affect 50 Cent. It won't just affect Houston. It could reshape how power is understood across the entire culture. So now it comes down to you. Was this a moment where a global superstar underestimated a local system? Or was it the beginning of a shift, where that system is about to be tested in a way it never has before? Because one thing is clear. In a world where respect, reputation, and control all collide, the real outcome is never revealed in the first chapter. And this story, it still feels like it's being written. So now I want to hear from you. After everything we just broke down, the alleged situation involving 50 Cent, the structure tied to Jay Prince, and the entire idea of checking in. What do you think this really is? Is it a system built on respect? A necessary structure that protects people moving through unfamiliar territory? Or is it something else? Something that forces even the biggest names to fall in line? Drop your opinion below, but don't just pick a side. Explain it. Because this isn't a simple debate. This is about how power actually works behind the scenes. And your perspective is part of that conversation. If you want more breakdowns like this, stories that go deeper than headlines, make sure you stay locked in. Because next, we're going even further into the world around Jay Prince, his history, his connections, and how far that influence really reaches. Trust me, that's a layer you don't want to miss. Because this story, it's not finished. And now you're part of it.